Look in any kitchen drawer from 1955 and you will find a wooden-handled paring knife stained brown from years of bacon grease. That stain was not laziness. It was insulation. Number 16 on this list is the way grandmothers seasoned their cast iron with a glass of leftover beer that the FDA spent 2 decades trying to ban. Number 12 stretched a pound of butter with skim milk and a pinch of borax until it spread for 6 weeks. Number 5 on this list is a meat curing trick using saltpeter that home canning manuals quietly dropped after the 1970s and that scientists now study at Cornell. They were not following recipes. They were following memory. Now hit that subscribe button and open the drawer, because here are 60 banned kitchen hacks scientists now say were genius. Number 16, storing potatoes in sand in the root cellar. Jewel's potato crop, about 300 pounds from the backfield, went into the dugout root cellar behind the cabin the second week of October 1955. Her husband had dug down 4 feet, lined the walls with field stone, and built a plank ceiling over it. Inside, she layered the potatoes in clean river sand from Coosa Creek, each one barely touching the next, the sand keeping them dry and dark and cool. A bushel of sand held 50 pounds of potatoes. The sand pulled moisture away from the skin and stopped the sprouts from starting. Not one potato sprouted before March. Every farm in Union County did the same, some with sand, some with sawdust, some with dry oak leaves. The temperature inside the cellar held at 48 degrees year-round. Jewel pulled the first spring potato in April, firm and fresh, 8 months after harvest. You can build a working root cellar in your backyard today for under $100. Pot liquor was the liquid left in the pot after a long cook of greens with pork. Dark, glossy, smelling of collards and ham and something mineral underneath. In mountain households, it was not a byproduct to discard, but a dish in its own right, poured into a tin cup and drunk while the greens were being plated, or used to soak the cornbread so it could carry more flavor to the mouth per bite. The mineral content was genuinely high. A long cook drew calcium, iron, and B vitamins from the greens that would otherwise be lost. And mountain people understood this without nutritional vocabulary, but with hard practical knowledge passed across generations. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt entered a public debate about whether pot liquor should be drunk as broth or sopped with cornbread. A moment that tells you something about how seriously this liquid was regarded. The ones who knew it best always drank it straight from the cup first, still hot enough to steam. When she left the kitchen for the last time, that cup went cold, and nobody thought to fill it. But before the garden could grow anything at all, someone had to keep the seeds alive. And the seeds in the tin box on the second shelf were not last year's seeds. They were 20 years of the same family of beans, the same strain of hard corn, each generation selected from the healthiest plants of the summer before. Amish heirloom seed saving stretched back to the community's Swiss and German origins in the early 18th century. The wet fermentation method for tomato seeds, letting them sit in their own pulp for 2 or 3 days until the gel coating rotted away and the viable seed sank, was something only the experienced gardener knew to do. Stored in a sealed tin in a cool, dark corner, those seeds held their germination rate for 3 years or more. The variety that grows best in your specific valley is not in any catalog. It lives only in the seeds she saved last September, and she is not saving them anymore. There was a moment in the drying, usually around the 3rd day, when the strips of venison hanging from the rafters stopped smelling like raw meat and started smelling smoky and mineral and faintly sweet, and that was the sign the cure had taken. Elk and deer were the preferred jerk meats for one clear reason: lean muscle, almost no fat, which meant the strips dried evenly and wouldn't go rancid the way bear would. Captain William Clark wrote in April of 1806 that the expedition had been curing dried meat since their last encampment, strips cut paper thin with a Green River knife, scored to increase the drying surface, rubbed with salt when available, and dried raw when it wasn't. Green hickory smoke from a low, smoldering fire added both preservation and a flavor still air couldn't give. You tested finished jerk by bending a strip, flex without cracking, then snap clean when folded double. The men who got it right fed themselves for weeks. The ones who pulled it too early found out in the middle of a blizzard when the smell from the rafter hooks changed and there was nothing left to replace it. The water left in the pot after boiling potatoes, cloudy, starchy, and usually dumped straight down the drain, was one of the most useful liquids in the kitchen, and wasting it would have gotten you a look that needed no words. That starchy water went straight into bread dough, where it gave the crumb a softer, moister texture and helped the yeast activate faster than plain water could. Biscuit dough made with potato water rose higher and stayed tender longer. Gravy thinned with it had more body than gravy thinned with plain water. Some cooks used it to start soup stock, and others poured it over the garden as a mild fertilizer, since the potassium leached from the potatoes fed the soil. In German and Scandinavian immigrant households across the upper Midwest and the Appalachian valleys, potato water was saved as automatically as bacon grease. It had a jar, a spot on the counter, and a purpose that nobody questioned. Lard medicinal treatments provided relief when doctor visits cost money families desperately needed for survival. Pure rendered lard served as the base for countless home remedies passed down through generations. Mixed with camphor and applied to chests, it loosened congestion and soothed coughs during winter illnesses. Rubbed into cracked, bleeding hands after hard labor, it softened skin and promoted healing. Combined with turpentine on flannel cloths, it created poultices drawing infection from wounds and relieving muscle aches. Mothers kept jars of medicated lard ready for emergencies, knowing professional care remained beyond reach. The fat's moisturizing properties made it effective for diaper rash, chapped lips, and dry scalp. Some families added herbs like eucalyptus for therapeutic effects. This hack kept families functional when illness threatened everything. The practice taught children that healing often came from kitchen cupboards. Stale bread revived with water was grandmother's refusal to waste a single slice when the loaf turned hard and dry overnight. Instead of tossing it for the birds or grinding it into crumbs, she ran the entire loaf quickly under the faucet, letting water dampen the crust without soaking through to the center. Then she wrapped it tightly in foil and placed it in a hot oven for 10 minutes. The bread emerged soft, warm, and steaming as if freshly baked that morning. The water turned to steam inside the foil, rehydrating the crumb while the crust crisped up perfectly. This trick worked for rolls, baguettes, and any yeast bread that had dried out on the counter. Children couldn't tell the difference between revived bread and fresh, and families stretched their grocery dollars further. The technique represented Grandma's fundamental belief that food deserved respect and second chances before being discarded. Salt preserved food and cleaned homes throughout the 1960s when this ancient mineral served purposes that modern products have struggled to improve upon. Coarse salt scoured cast iron pans without damaging seasoning, absorbed fresh stains from carpets, and removed rust from metal surfaces. The abrasive crystals provided mechanical cleaning action, while sodium chloride inhibited bacterial growth. Grandmothers mixed salt with lemon juice for copper cleaning, combined it with vinegar for drain maintenance, and sprinkled it on oven spills for easy removal. The mineral was inexpensive, completely non-toxic, and effective for dozens of household applications. Saltwater gargles treated sore throats, salt soaks reduced swelling in tired feet, and salt scrubs exfoliated skin before commercial spa products existed. When specialized cleaners arrived promising better results, salt retreated to seasoning food alone. Scientists confirm salt remains equally effective for many household cleaning applications. Darning socks was the evening ritual that kept families walking on repaired fabric rather than spending on replacements. When holes appeared in heels or toes, mothers and grandmothers would stretch the sock over a wooden darning egg or light bulb, then weave thread back and forth across the gap until new fabric formed. The technique required patience and skill, creating patches that could outlast the original material when done properly. Children sat and watched, learning the over-under pattern that would serve them throughout their lives. A single pair of socks might accumulate multiple darning patches over years of wear, becoming more repair than original fabric. The practice wasn't limited to socks. Sweaters, gloves, and any knitted item received the same careful attention. Darning thread cost pennies while new socks cost dollars, making the math undeniable. Families kept darning supplies in sewing baskets passed through generations. The skill represented self-sufficiency and the refusal to let clothing die before its time. Baking soda was sometimes something people used to reduce the acidity of the soil, with the added belief that this helped to make tomatoes taste a lot sweeter by putting a soft cap on their acidity. Baking soda is an alkaline substance, after all. If the soil is far too acidic, it can help to adjust the pH level until it's suitable. Some gardeners really believed in lowering acidity, especially with tomatoes. They thought the technique essentially helped to produce sweeter tomatoes, but this isn't actually all that true. The sugar content in tomatoes is something that's decided mostly by watering habits and the variety, so this is definitely a case where nurture is more what the situation needs. Most gardeners did realize that this was not a substitute for fertilization and/or active care, though. It was just something they used to help give it a small band-aid fix, and it's not like they were dumping heaps of soda onto it. This one's a bit of a miss, more or less. It's a small fix, but it's also a bigger myth than anything else. I'm not really sure how I feel about baking soda going into my crops, though. I mean, you already hear way too much about all these microplastics taking over everything, right? Despite what you hear about the Depression every now and then, it actually was true that people started to make all kinds of gravy from drippings. It was a pretty practical way of making use of scraps and leftovers, after all. Drippings kind of mean the fat that people got from cooking meat. Every time they would cook any kind of meat, they'd always gather the fat drippings from it. This was true of beef, pork, chicken, and just about everything else that was considered meat. Food was really scarce during the Depression, and the budgets were even tighter. There wasn't room to waste anything and spend more money on buying packets of meat one after the other. After the cooking was done, people would take the fat and use that as a base for the gravy they'd eventually make. Some of that all-purpose flour we went over earlier would also help thicken the fat and give it this really nice texture that actually resembles something like a gravy. Plus, a makeshift sauce could be made that would be served with basic vegetables and herbs. Fat needs to be stored, though, and it was hard to store enough of it to make sure you had a good supply that would last you, but also wouldn't spoil. People had to get good at all kinds of things, and budgeting your resources, not just your dollars, was one of them. Ice water to peel eggs is really common, and I'm sure it's something you've heard of before too. See, the boiling of an egg does two things to the egg. One, the protein inside the whites and the yolks comes together and really solidifies. Pretty convenient for eating purposes, but not so much for peeling ones. The heat is what makes the egg expand after all, but it also kind of means the shell sticks to the egg now. When you take that egg that was just drenched in hot water and instead put it in some ice-cold water, you create a cool little thing known as thermal shock. Have you ever been taking a really hot shower and then taken a really cold one, only to find your muscles cramping up? Yeah, that's the same concept here. The cold makes the egg contract, and pretty badly at that. It can be a pretty big pain waiting to peel all your eggs after you just waited a decent bit to boil all of them, so next time, save yourself some time, do everyone a favor and just pour some really cold water in a glass or bowl. This one is similarly another one you may have not only heard of, but seen, tried, and tested for yourself. Toasting spices in a pan can do wonders for their flavor. It is like steroids with athletes, except nothing about it messes up your system. Just a little bit of toasting can really bring out every last drop of flavor from whatever spices you are working with, and the end result you get is an explosively flavorful dish that packs thrice the punch you thought it would. Sounds like a pretty good deal this time too, right? Ever thought about why this happens, though? You know how spices have these oils in them, and they are largely what is responsible for that banging taste we are all used to? Once you toast them, the heat starts to draw out those oils and it kind of puts them on turbo mode. Cumin gets more healthy, chilies are no longer just spicy enough to make your eyes water, but sweet and smoky too, and coriander really gets flavor. Kerosene stain remover was a powerful cleaning solution that lifted grease, oil, and stubborn marks from fabric when commercial products were unavailable or unaffordable. Families kept kerosene on hand for lamps and heaters, discovering its secondary use as a remarkably effective degreaser. Small amounts dabbed onto stained fabric would dissolve grease and oil that water couldn't touch, lifting marks from work clothes and kitchen linens. The technique required careful application and thorough washing afterward to remove the kerosene smell, but the results justified the extra effort. Mechanics and farmers especially valued this hack, knowing their heavily soiled work clothes could be salvaged rather than discarded. Women shared the technique at quilting bees and church gatherings, spreading practical knowledge through community networks. The kerosene cost nothing extra since families already stocked it, making this hack purely about creative repurposing of existing resources. Number 24. Seasoning cast iron with hog lard. Jules' skillet was 22 years old in 1955. Her husband's mother had given it to her in 1933 as a wedding gift. It had never been washed with soap, and it never would be. Once or twice a year, she rubbed a thin layer of rendered hog lard inside it, set it upside down over the open firebox of the cook stove, and let it bake until the smoke stopped rising. That was the old way, passed down through generations. Every meal built another layer of black on the iron. The surface turned glassy. Nothing stuck, and her skillet was not a pan anymore. It was a record of every meal ever cooked in it. But what most people miss is that a properly seasoned skillet outlasts 3 non-stick pans from the store. Jules' daughter still uses that same skillet today. You can season your own the same way, with the same hog lard. A powerful tool, passed down without a receipt. She made the mush at night when supper was done, because it needed all night to set. Cornmeal went into salted boiling water, and she stirred it until it thickened past porridge, dense enough to hold the spoon's path for a moment before closing. A process that took 40 minutes of constant attention. She poured it into a bread loaf pan, smoothed the top flat, and left it on the counter until morning. By dawn, it had firmed into a sliceable loaf. She cut it into half-inch slabs and fried each one in bacon grease until the outside was golden and crisped while the inside stayed soft. Called mersh by some families in the hill communities of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, fried cornmeal mush was food that required nothing special and wasted nothing. Every bit left from supper became something better at breakfast. The crackle of the crust is what the children who grew up on it still remember. Their grandchildren do not know the dish exists. The elderberry bush at the edge of the property was not decorative. Every Amish household that kept one knew exactly what it was for, and the first cold snap was the signal to start the syrup. You simmered ripe elderberries in water until the juice ran dark as ink, strained every bit of pulp, and combined the liquid with raw honey in a ratio that varied by family. A spoonful every morning through winter. Documented remedies from Emma Jonas M. Byler's collection. Plain and Happy Living also used equal parts elderberry blossoms and peppermint leaves steeped in boiling water for stomach flu. 1 cup every hour until the nausea lifted. The grandmother who taught you to make it would have said the mechanism was the wrong question. The right question was whether the family stayed well through February. They usually did. Now the bush grows untended, and nobody can say when they last made a jar. The trick with parched corn was heat and patience, and knowing when to pull it. If you had to ask, you weren't ready to be making it. Dry field corn, fully matured and hard as gravel, went into a cast iron skillet over low heat, stirred constantly, and over the course of an hour the kernels toasted from pale gold to deeper brown, the starch converting into something shelf-stable and dense that needed no cooking and no moisture to survive months in a buckskin pouch. Lewis and Clark called their version sagamite, borrowed from Native American trail rations, and their 1806 journals document parched corn and dried meat as the core of the expedition diet on the hardest stretches. A handful in your coat pocket suppressed hunger for hours. It couldn't freeze, couldn't rot, couldn't be ruined by a river crossing. What began as a grain nobody would eat raw became the most reliable survival food in the mountain tradition. Not because it tasted good, but because it was always there when nothing else was. The eggshells went in with the grounds, crushed between the palm and dropped right into the pot. and the coffee came out cleaner than any paper filter could manage. This was cowboy coffee and farmhouse coffee all the way back to the 1800s, and the trick was chemistry, not folklore. Crushed eggshells are mostly calcium carbonate, which is alkaline, and when the hot water hit them, they neutralized the acids in the coffee and pulled the loose grounds to the bottom of the pot. The result was a cup that was smoother, less bitter, and almost perfectly clear. No grit, no sludge, no grounds floating on top. In the mountains of East Tennessee and western North Carolina, old women swore the shells made the coffee taste sweeter, and they were not wrong. Reducing acidity lets the natural sweetness come forward. Albumin from the shell membrane acted as a clarifying agent, the same protein used in winemaking. She never called it that. She just called it making coffee right. Dandelion coffee became the morning ritual for families who could no longer afford real coffee beans during the Depression's worst years. The process began by digging dandelion roots from yards and fields, plants growing everywhere without cost. These roots were scrubbed clean, chopped into small pieces, and roasted slowly in cast iron pans until dark brown and brittle. Ground into powder using hand mills or pounded between stones, the roasted roots produced a surprisingly rich, earthy brew when steeped in boiling water. The taste carried hints of coffee's bitterness without caffeine, providing comfort on cold mornings when real coffee remained a distant luxury. Children often helped with harvesting, learning to identify the jagged leaves and deep taproots making the best substitute. Some families mixed dandelion with chicory root for deeper flavor. This hack kept morning traditions alive when store shelves might as well have been empty. Flour sack towels served purposes modern kitchen linens simply cannot match, and Grandma kept stacks for every task imaginable. These weren't purchased. They came from fabric bags that flour and sugar were packaged in. The cotton was tightly woven, lint-free, and incredibly absorbent, perfect for straining homemade cheese, covering rising bread dough, and drying dishes without streaks. Grandma bleached them white for kitchen use, but some women sewed printed versions into children's clothing and quilts. The towels improved with washing, becoming softer over years rather than falling apart like paper towels. They could be sterilized with boiling water for canning season and wrapped around delicate items for storage. When one finally wore thin, it became a cleaning rag, then patches for other towels. The journey from flour packaging to dust rag took decades, demonstrating a relationship with materials that disposable culture has abandoned. Fermented vegetables filled crocks in the 1960s pantries, where sauerkraut, pickles, and kimchi provided probiotics long before the term entered vocabulary. The lacto-fermentation process created beneficial bacteria that populated digestive systems and supported immune function in ways modern science has documented. Grandmothers maintained fermentation crocks carefully. Understanding these preserved vegetables contributed something essential to family health. The process increased vitamin content, particularly B vitamins and vitamin K2, while making minerals more bioavailable. The sour tang of properly fermented vegetables indicated successful bacterial activity, transforming raw ingredients into living foods. Salt concentration and temperature control were managed through experience passed from mother to daughter. When pasteurized canned vegetables and refrigeration made fermentation seem unnecessary, living foods largely disappeared from American tables. Scientists now recommend fermented foods as essential for gut microbiome health. String and twine balls grew from every piece of packaging cord saved and wound together into useful spheres that served countless purposes. Before tape became common, string tied packages, secured bundles, hung pictures, and repaired everything from broken handles to torn book bindings. Families saved every scrap, winding pieces together regardless of length or thickness. The resulting balls often contained decades of accumulated string, growing large enough to fill hands. Kitchen string tied roasts and sealed food bags. Workshop twine bound tools and measured distances. Garden string trained climbing plants and marked rows. Children learned to tie knots using string from the family ball, developing skills that served them throughout life. When string was needed, someone retrieved the ball and cut exactly what the job required. No waste, no excess. The practice eliminated a recurring expense that added up over years of household operation. String balls represented physical proof of thrift accumulated one saved piece at a time. Using newspapers as this really natural barrier to help suppress weed growth is a very time-tested gardening trick. It's one of the most affordable and biodegradable options you can go for, and most alternatives are plastic or fabric blockers that, while doing the job, also introduce a host of harmful little things that can tamper with the growth of your plant. Newspaper basically helps to block sunlight and retains the moisture of the soil, and since it breaks down over time and is cost-effective and eco-friendly, then it essentially means that this is free, better than anything on the market, and it doesn't mess with your plant at all. You would just need to put down around 5 sheets of newspaper over those pesky areas where weed tends to grow, overlap the edges, and wet the paper itself, and then cover it with straw or compost. You keep reapplying this whenever you need to, and you're essentially safe. One of the best ways for sustenance during this entire fiasco was easily corn. Cornmeal, in specific, was really helpful for the masses. This is because corn was one of the few crops that America could grow native to its own soil. It was also one of the few crops that was not experiencing massive amounts of failure during harvest. I really can't stress how bad this time was for the land as well, not just the people. The Dust Bowl was something that left all kinds of consequences on the face of the country. Crops seriously were never ever growing. People were trying to find their green thumb and get something going in victory gardens, which is a whole other concept we'll talk about later. But it wasn't really working. Cornmeal was the perfect thing to rely on for many reasons. First, you didn't run into these kinds of issues when you were making some simple cornmeal. Second, if you couldn't grow it because you just didn't live near any regions that had fertile land or were from the places struck by the bowl, then you could buy it for dirt cheap. Third of all, and this is the real kicker, there are actual detailed documents the size of mini novels that show you all the different kinds of recipes you can make with cornmeal. It also really helped that most of these recipes were really easy to make and adaptable to what you had on hand too. Storing herbs in an ice cube tray works incredibly well because it really helps to keep them fresh, at least as fresh as they really can be. The herbs are very fragile, and if you've spent a lot of time seasoning your food, this isn't something I need to tell you. The essential oils in these are pretty much non-existent the moment they come into contact with air, and that only starts becoming more of a problem the longer that exposure lasts. They don't do well with light or heat either, which is why an ice cube tray works for 3 reasons. 1, it helps preserve their freshness. Okay, tell me why, right? Well, ice cube trays put a little roadblock in a neat and slightly annoying process I affectionately call oxidation, and that really helps to keep spoilage issues low. That's all thanks to the cold temperature helping the enzymes stay away from the tissues of the herbs, and in turn, the oils that are with them. 2, there's only so much space in a tray, so you only take out the amount of herbs you need, which helps you keep spoilage to a low anyway. Third, you always place these trays in freezers, away from any kind of light or heat, which gives the herbs the perfect environment they need to rest and chill until you need to take them out. The typical scrambled eggs breakfast has been more or less a national tradition for so many years, it is impossible to tell where it really started. Low-key, small-time diners, high-tier French-American restaurants, and steakhouses all serve some kind of variation on eggs, including scrambled-ons. Hence, what do you do to add a little bit of variety, texture, and a bit of spaz to this classical option? If mayonnaise can work wonders for a burger, why not try it here? No, seriously, you'd be surprised. We know most people never make the link between eggs and mayo, but they can actually make them so much more fluffier and add this nice creamy texture too. If you do not believe us, then just search up any grandma's recipe for mayo eggs. Do not knock it till you try it. Vinegar copper cleaner transformed tarnished pots, pans, and hardware into gleaming surfaces using nothing but pantry vinegar and table salt. The method was simple enough that children could help with the task, mixing white vinegar with salt to create a paste that cut through oxidation and grime. Families would rub this mixture onto copper surfaces using old rags or their bare hands, watching dark tarnish dissolve away to reveal the warm orange metal underneath. The chemical reaction between acid and salt broke down the oxidized layer without scratching or damaging the copper beneath. Mountain households took pride in their copper cookware, often passed down through generations, and this cleaning method kept heirloom pieces functional and beautiful. The same mixture worked on brass door hardware, cabinet pulls, and decorative items throughout the home. No store-bought polish could match the effectiveness or the satisfaction of watching grime disappear. Number 22. Salt-curing pork in the smokehouse. The hog was killed the first cold week of December in 1955 when the temperature held below 40 for 3 days straight. Jewel and her husband used 10 pounds of salt for every 100 pounds of meat. They rubbed it into the shoulder, the belly, the ham, every crevice. The meat went on waist-high shelves in the log smokehouse and sat for 6 weeks while the winter cold did the work a refrigerator would have done. Then a low hickory fire was built under the meat for 2 days until the ham turned mahogany. That ham hung in the smokehouse through the next summer. One hog fed the family for a year. Back then, a pound of cured ham at the Blairsville store cost 69 cents, but a home-cured ham from a home-raised hog cost nothing but salt and patience, and that is the math your great-grandmother ran every December. Nobody measured the cornmeal. You wet your hands, scooped from the bag, added salt water until the meal clumped without falling apart, and shaped it into an oval in your palms, flat on the bottom, rounded on top. Corn pone was older than the cast-iron skillet itself. The earliest versions were baked on a hoe blade held over an open fire, which is where the name hoe cake came from in the communities that used both words interchangeably. Pone was the bread of weeks when a family couldn't spare the buttermilk or eggs that cornbread required. Nothing but meal, water, salt, and heat. The outside went hard and golden, developing a crust that crackled under pressure, while the inside stayed dense and slightly gummy, and that texture was the point. It held up in a bowl of beans without dissolving. You never used a spoon to shape it. If you needed a spoon, you weren't ready to make it. She shaped 12 pones in the time it took most people to find a recipe card, moving through the routine so automatically she could do it in the dark, and everyone came out the same. The smokehouse stood apart from everything else, away from the house to keep sparks clear, away from the barn to keep the smell from the animals. Every Amish farm that took its independence seriously had one. The structure was small, maybe 8 feet square, built tight from hardwood planks with a dirt floor and a firebox set low in one wall so smoke rose slowly to the meat hanging from iron hooks above. The wood mattered. Hickory and apple gave pork a sweetness. Oak gave beef depth. Cherry turned a cured ham to the deep reddish brown that told you the smoke had gone all the way through. You salted the meat first, coarse salt packed into every surface over several days, then smoked it slowly at temperatures low enough to preserve rather than cook. The finished hams and slabs of bacon hung through winter and into spring, shelf-stable without a single day of refrigeration. The man who tended the smokehouse was the man his community called when anyone's supply ran short. When the last one on our road came down 20 years ago, nobody rebuilt it. The bones were the last thing left after a kill, and the mountain man who knew what to do with them ate better than the one who threw them away. Large leg bones, bison, elk, deer, were split lengthwise with a heavy knife, and the halves went cut side up directly onto a bed of glowing coals. In 5 to 8 minutes, the marrow inside liquefied and began to bubble at the edges, and what came out was something fur trade accounts from the early 1800s describe as beurre de nature, a fat so rich and deeply flavored that mountain men spread it on toasted bannock the way a finer man might spread butter at a proper table. Marrow fat doesn't freeze at the same temperature as regular fat. It stays semi-liquid even in cold, which made it one of the only fats that remained usable straight from a frozen carcass. Bone marrow is now a restaurant delicacy at $40 a plate. The mountain man scraped it from a split femur with a stick, crouching over a fire in a blizzard, and he understood exactly what he had without needing anyone to tell him. The toughest cut of pork or the oldest chicken in the yard could still make a decent meal if you knew the buttermilk trick, and every woman in those kitchens knew it without anyone having to explain why. You soaked the meat overnight in buttermilk, sometimes with a little salt, and by morning the lactic acid had broken down the tough muscle fibers enough that even a rooster too old to chase hens would fry up tender. The low pH of buttermilk, around 4.5, gently denatured the proteins without turning the meat mushy the way vinegar marinades sometimes did. Across the South, this was the secret behind fried chicken that fell off the bone and pork chops that cut with a fork. The buttermilk also left a thin, tacky film on the surface that helped the flour coating stick during frying, which meant the crust stayed on the meat instead of sliding off into the grease. Cardboard shoe soles extended the life of worn footwear when replacement shoes were simply impossible to purchase. Families traced foot shapes onto sturdy cardboard from boxes, cutting precise insoles fitting inside shoes whose leather bottoms had worn through. Some households kept stacks of pre-cut insoles ready, knowing wet weather would dissolve one pair quickly. Children walked to school with cardboard between their feet and the ground, learning early that complaining changed nothing when resources were scarce. More skilled families layered cardboard with newspaper for durability, sometimes coating the bottom with melted wax for water resistance. The cardboard compressed throughout the day, requiring nightly replacement in many cases. What seemed like a temporary fix often became a permanent solution lasting months. This hack taught children that ingenuity could solve problems that money could not, a lesson shaping how an entire generation approached challenges. Onion skins for dyeing Easter eggs produced colors that store-bought tablets could never match: deep amber, rusty brown, and burnished gold that looked like treasures. Grandma saved yellow and brown skins for weeks before Easter, stuffing them into paper bags. Eggs wrapped in those papery skins, secured with rubber bands, then simmered gently in water with vinegar to help color adhere. Results were stunning natural marbling effects, each egg emerging unique. Some grandmothers pressed small leaves against shells before wrapping, creating botanical prints impossibly delicate. Red onion skins produced lavender tones while yellow created deep golds. This connected families to centuries of tradition when synthetic dyes didn't exist. The eggs were completely safe since onion skins were food grade. Children gathered watching eggs transform, learning patience and appreciating beauty from simple natural sources. Bone broth simmering on back burners was constant in 1960s kitchens, where frugal cooks threw nothing away and extracted every nutrient from chicken carcasses and beef bones. The slow extraction released collagen, gelatin, and minerals, including calcium and magnesium, into rich golden liquid that formed the base for soups. Modern nutritional science validates this practice, confirming bone broth contains amino acids like glycine and proline that support gut health and reduce inflammation. The gelatin helps heal intestinal lining, a benefit functional medicine practitioners now prescribe for digestive disorders. Grandmothers simmered bones for 24 hours, achieving maximum extraction without understanding the chemistry. The broth was given to sick family members and nursing mothers needing easily digestible nutrition. When canned soups and bouillon cubes promised convenience, homemade bone broth seemed unnecessarily time-consuming. Today, it sells for premium prices while scientists confirm its superior profile. Button jars preserved tiny fasteners that represented significant savings when clothing needed repairs or alterations. Before discarding any worn garment, families cut off every button, sorting them into jars by size, color, and material. The collections grew over years, becoming treasure troves of options when buttons popped off or broke. Children helped with sorting, learning to identify button types and imagine their future uses. When a shirt lost a button, the jar provided matches or acceptable substitutes without requiring store trips. Creative mothers used mismatched buttons deliberately, creating folk art aesthetics from necessity. The jars themselves became heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter with accumulated buttons spanning decades. Finding the perfect button meant digging through layers of family history. A single button at a store might cost as much as a loaf of bread, making the jar's contents genuinely valuable. The practice taught children that small things mattered, and nothing useful should ever be thrown away. Three Sisters planting is a method that's been used by indigenous companions for centuries. It's a planting technique that actually makes use of some of their most widely planted crops too. Beans, squash, and corn work together, and each plant helps to serve a very specific purpose, which essentially creates this little organically sustained, automated ecosystem that boosts plant growth. Pretty neat, huh? So, how does all this work? The corn helps to work as a natural trellis that beans can use to climb, so it gives some much-needed vertical support to them throughout their growth. Think of it like a crutch. Now, on the other hand, beans help to fix all kinds of nitrogen, since legumes add that to the soil. Why does this matter? Well, you now effectively do not need fertilizer as often. Squash, on the other hand, helps to shade the soil and suppress weeds while also retaining moisture. So with just these three simple things, you've got yourself some pretty solid plant protection. It's honestly just like getting a good cleanser, moisturizer, and sunscreen, but like for plants. The downsides of this is that it was something that was only applicable to larger garden beds, and not every farmer had that kind of space to work with. Plus, the corn has to be strong. If you happen to have a harvest full of weak corn, then it may just collapse instead of helping the beans climb. Another thing that got really popular was the entire concept of canned food. This was something industries would cash in on like an African gold mine later on in America's history and people's lives, but it made its debut on the grand stage here. During the Depression, canned food had become a lifesaver for so many different kinds of reasons. It was easy to preserve, which was the biggest one. This was always the kind of thing you would get for long trips, journeys where you'd go days without seeing stores, or for times like these. The stuff in those cans was built to last for months, and so were the cans. It also meant that people were able to get things pre-cut and made for them. If you got canned pineapple, for example, the fruit was already sliced into rings for you and put in juice. Get an actual pineapple, and you might save yourself a cent or two, but it would also take 10 times the work to get that sucker open. Energy was something people lacked, so whenever they saw convenience that they didn't have to spend a lot on, they'd take it. You could also get canned vegetables and fruit in just about anything. When people saw how much it helped preserve things, they started canning things and putting them in jars with airtight seals as well. The last thing, and I mean the absolute worst-case scenario in the Depression, was you letting something go to waste. It was a precious resource that you no longer had, and everything had to be used until the very last drop, because who was guaranteeing that the house could restock? Luck and nothing else. So storing lettuce in damp cloths follows pretty much the exact same principles we went over while we were discussing how bread can help you get your sugar back. It's all about moisture retention, but this time around it's also got a lot to do with regulating the temperature of the lettuce. This really helps maintain the vegetable, because lettuce usually contains a lot of water, and that makes it easily perishable. Bummer, right? Especially when we use it in so many things, which always prompts you to buy in bulk. But that may not be the right idea, since you end up with wilted and dried lettuce, and no one wants that, right? Putting a damp cloth on it helps keep it humid, which means that the lettuce gets a perpetual source of moisture. This helps to keep the moisture in for long, and the cloth itself helps to absorb moisture coming in from the air and helps buffer the temperature too. You get a consistent humidity this way and some airflow since it is a cloth. All of this works really well by giving lettuce essentially the perfect environment it needs to last longer. Speaking of turnoffs, something that detracts from all the maritime goodness fish has to offer is that offensive odor that tends to come with most seafood you will catch. Funnily enough, soaking your fish in milk can quickly eliminate that issue. Look, there is no easy way to say it. It stinks, and it stinks bad. It is not something you would want with your food, much less constantly oozing out of your fridge every time you open it. Grandmas did know that fish is too essential of a superfood to just cut out of the diets of growing healthy kids, though. Naturally, they did what they do best and scoured the ends of the culinary world looking for a way to solve the problem. The answer was always much closer to them than they would think, almost right under their nose. When you soak fish in milk for about 20 minutes, It bonds with the protein in the milk and the compounds in the fish responsible for that ghastly smell stick with the beverage afterwards. When you extract it, you get a clean-tasting fish with none of that ridiculous funk. Flour paste wallpaper adhesive was homemade glue that hung wallpaper, sealed envelopes, and repaired torn books without requiring store-bought products. The recipe called for cooking flour and water together over low heat until the mixture thickened into smooth paste. The result was strong, flexible adhesive that dried clear and held paper firmly against surfaces. Families used this paste to decorate their homes with wallpaper scraps, catalog pages, or newspaper sheets, brightening otherwise plain wooden walls. The same paste sealed important letters, repaired children's school books, and attached labels to canning jars. Making paste became a household skill passed from mothers to daughters, with each family adjusting flour-to-water ratios based on experience. The paste cost virtually nothing and worked as well as commercial products for most paper applications. It represented self-sufficiency, proving that basic cooking skills could solve problems far beyond the kitchen. Number 17. Drying apples on a window screen in the sun. The apples came off the two old Arkansas black trees behind Jules' barn the third week of September 1955, about 6 bushels between them. She peeled and cored and sliced them into 8 wedges each. She laid the wedges on 2 old window screens set up on sawhorses out on the front porch. The screens let the air move around every slice. A piece of cheesecloth on top kept the flies off. She turned the slices once a day for 5 days. By the 6th day, they were brown, leathery, and shrunk to 1/3 of the original weight. She tied them up in clean cotton flour sacks and hung them from the ceiling beams of the cabin. Through winter, those dried apples became stack cakes, fried pies, and sweetness in a pot of sweet potatoes. No jar, no sugar, no heat, no power. Just the sun. A bag of store-bought dried apples at the A&P cost 34 cents in 1955. Jules spent 0. That is the whole argument for a screen on a sawhorse. Before there was a smokehouse on the property, and many families never had one, there was the salt box, and it did the same work by different means. After the November butchering, cuts that couldn't be eaten fresh went into a wooden box packed with dry salt. The rule was absolute. Every surface had to be covered, pressed in by hand to leave nothing exposed. Salt packing drew out the moisture bacteria needed, working slowly until the meat was stable enough to last well into the following summer. A whole ham might need 4 to 6 weeks under salt, smaller slabs of side meat, 2. The salt was often cut with brown sugar and a little saltpeter, a formula passed by watching, never by measuring. In 1930s Appalachia, a 50-pound bag of plain salt cost less than $1 and was one of the most critical purchases made each fall. The salt box required nothing but cold air, the salt, and the knowledge of how thick to pack it. That last part was the hardest thing to hold on to. Lye soap was about preserving the household, and before there was a store to buy it from, every bar on the washstand was something your hands had made from ash and fat. Amish lye soap started at the wood stove, specifically with the hardwood ash from weeks of burning oak and hickory. That ash went into a leaching barrel with water dripped slowly through it, and what came out the bottom was lye. You combined that lye with rendered animal fat, both cooled to within a few degrees of each other, and stirred for up to an hour until the mixture thickened to pudding. That thickening was called the trace. You cut the bars and cured them on wooden racks for several weeks. Mattie Stutzman of Sinking Spring, Ohio, whose recipe was documented in Amish homemaking records, described the finished bars as gentle on skin and effective on everything else. She spent nothing on commercial soap her entire married life. Ash cakes were the bread of the cabin fireplace at its most stripped down. Cornmeal and water and nothing else, cooked not near the fire but inside it. Coarse cornmeal and cold water worked by hand until the dough held shape, pressed flat and wrapped in corn husks or cabbage leaves before going directly onto the glowing coals. 5 to 7 minutes aside, and when you knocked the ash off and peeled back the husk, the crust crackled under your thumbnail and the center steamed with a smell of corn and wood smoke that no iron oven ever replicated. The corn husk wrapping was the invention. It sealed the outside in the first seconds of coal contact, keeping the interior from drying while the heat worked through. African American cooks across the Mountain South had perfected this technique across generations, passing it through households that worked without specialized cookware, with nothing beyond fire and hands and the clarity to use what was there. The ash cake was not a compromise. It was an answer. And it slipped away when the wood stove went, and the wood stove went when the gas line came. It looked ridiculous and worked perfectly. A leg of pantyhose hanging from a nail in the root cellar, bulging with onions spaced apart by knots tied between each one. The nylon mesh allowed air to circulate around every onion individually, preventing the moisture buildup that causes rot when onions touch each other in a bin. You tied a knot, dropped an onion, tied another knot, dropped another until the whole leg was full. When you needed one, you cut below the bottom knot and the rest stayed in place. Families across the upland South used this method from at least the 1940s onward, and a properly stored string could last 6 to 8 months, long enough to carry a household from fall harvest through to spring. The kids thought it was the funniest thing in the cellar. The woman who hung them there was not laughing. She was making sure there would be onions in the soup come February, and she was right every single time. Newspaper insulation was one of the most widespread survival hacks families used when winter winds cut through thin walls. Families collected old newspapers from neighbors and churches, stuffing them between wall studs, under floorboards, and inside attic spaces to create barriers against the cold. The layered paper trapped air pockets that slowed heat loss remarkably well. Children helped by crumpling sheets into tight balls that fit snugly into cracks around windows and doors. Some families even lined their clothing with newspaper, tucking pages inside coats and wrapping feet before sliding into worn shoes. The rustling sound of paper-lined garments became familiar in schoolrooms across rural America. What made this hack valuable was its complete lack of cost. Newspapers that would otherwise burn gained new life as thermal protection. Mothers taught daughters this technique. Knowing resourcefulness meant survival when coal ran short. A pinch of salt in coffee was Grandma's answer to bitter brews that made faces pucker and stomachs clench. She didn't add sugar to mask bad coffee. She prevented bitterness with a few grains of salt added to grounds before percolating. Salt ions blocked taste receptors perceiving bitterness, allowing coffee's natural sweetness and complexity to shine. This worked especially well with cheaper blends and older beans that lost freshness, turning mediocre coffee into something smooth. During the Depression, when families couldn't afford quality beans, this trick made every pot palatable without expensive cream or sugar. Grandma added salt so instinctively she never measured. Just a pinch between fingers dropped into the basket. Visitors commented on how smooth her coffee tasted, never guessing the secret in the salt shaker. Modern baristas rediscovered this technique, but for decades it lived only in grandmother's muscle memory. Sunning laundry on outdoor clotheslines was universal practice in 1960s neighborhoods where sheets and clothing dried in fresh air while absorbing ultraviolet radiation that killed bacteria and bleached stains naturally. The antimicrobial effect was understood intuitively, leading housewives to hang sick children's bedding in direct sun for exposure. Modern research confirms UV radiation destroys bacteria, viruses, and fungal spores more effectively than many chemical disinfectants while leaving no residue. The natural bleaching removed stains without chlorine, preserving fabric integrity while achieving brightness chemical bleaches could not match. The process required no electricity, reduced utility bills, and left fabrics smelling of fresh air rather than synthetic fragrances. Clothes dried on lines lasted longer than those tumbled in hot dryers that stressed fibers. When electric dryers promised convenience regardless of weather, outdoor drying seemed old-fashioned. Scientists recommend sun exposure for disinfecting fabrics. Rubber band saving created stretchy treasure hoards that eliminated the need to ever purchase these small but useful items. Every rubber band that arrived wrapped around newspapers, produce, or mail was carefully removed and added to growing balls or stored in jars. The collections grew surprisingly large, providing bands whenever needed for sealing bags, bundling items, or creating makeshift repairs. Children contributed to the collection, understanding that even these tiny items cost money at stores. The rubber band ball became a fixture in kitchen drawers and workshop benches. Some families sorted by size, keeping different collections for different purposes. The practice extended rubber band life through careful use, never stretching beyond necessity, storing away from heat that caused brittleness. What seemed like obsessive hoarding was actually practical economics. Over years, the saved bands represented real money never spent, proving that wealth accumulated through countless small decisions to save rather than discard. Using milk for mildew control is actually one that's backed up by science, though. This was a really popular gardening hack, especially at curbing unwanted fungal growth, and this is because of a few reasons. So we all know that milk has protein in it, right? And if you didn't, then you might want to load up on a glass or two as a small little organic pre-workout. Anyway, it just so happens that when you expose milk to sunlight, the magical power of that big fiery ball helps to produce antimicrobial compounds that basically start to serve as a roadblock for mildew growth. Plus, the lactic acid bacteria that's present in milk also helps to control fungal spores and helps plants from contracting massive issues. Minerals that help to boost plant health and make them more resistant to different kinds of threats like diseases are also there, but there are a few downsides. The milk is prone to spoiling pretty quickly in the heat, while insects are attracted towards it as well. Plus, if spores are really your problem, you'd most likely be better off with a standard-issue chemical fungicide. This was more a rural trick for people who could not easily afford to go out and get milk, or for those who had their own cattle and had the milk to spare. So, about those stews I just talked about. They wouldn't add in just vegetables and potatoes. The entire idea was to not waste even a single thing. That means things outside our modern imagination too. For example, when's the last time you or I have used potato peels? Definitely not in recent memory for me. For people who were alive back then, though, they were literally adding in potato peels to their broths and stews. It was said that they were really good in regards to the amount of fiber they have. Have you ever had a conversation where a gym bro went off on you about micros and macros? You may have heard them mention fiber a lot. While I'm sorry for your wasted time if you've experienced that, I must say, they do have a point too. Fiber helps you be full for much longer and decreases your appetite. People were taking in everything they could to keep their appetites low, really. It's no wonder smoking became such a working-class-related phenomenon during this time in America's history. Cooking with canning jars is one of the most common things to do because they're built to do really well around high temperatures. People use it during sous vide, or to bake, or even when they're slow cooking. These jars are airtight, and their heat resistance really isn't a joke. You should look up how good tempered glass is when it comes to dealing with extreme heat, because it's literally the entire point of picking it out for the canning jars. The jars are usually heated to really high temperatures so that the food inside can be sterilized and preserved, and the glass actually expands and then contracts back to its original size and shape without breaking. This means you can place it on any source of heat, a stove, an oven, or even a pot of boiling hot water, and not worry about any glass exploding in your kitchen. If you cook with canning jars, then the context of slow cooking really is the best one to use them in. The airtight seal really helps to trap moisture in, which helps to boost the flavor of something by several levels. You also get some pretty even cooking since what you're cooking in doesn't have a lot of space, though that comes with some side effects like managing your portion or needing to cook a few more times than normal. Still, I bet you didn't know we could cook with canning jars, did you? Just like breadcrumbs have become synonymous with providing the perfect golden, crunchy exterior, crushed cornflakes have the same reputation from our grandparents' days. Most things you would add this to, like chicken fillets or strips, would get significantly more crunchier and crispier, and the coating did not taste as much like cereal as you were thinking it would. It actually just tasted like pretty good skin, the kind that crumbles and falls apart in your mouth as you bite into it. Probably the biggest benefit of your grandma cooking things up this way was that it really cut down on the grease factor. That can leave even the most loyal, crispy chicken lover feeling bloated, oily, and a little turned off for the day. Soap sliver ball was a thrifty bathroom hack that transformed unusable soap remnants into functional new bars through simple household chemistry. Families saved every soap sliver too small to use effectively, collecting them in jars or bowls until enough accumulated. The slivers were then moistened, pressed together firmly, and molded by hand into new bars that worked as well as fresh soap. Some families added hot water to soften the pieces before combining them, creating smoother finished products. Others grated the slivers and packed them into molds, producing bars with interesting marbled patterns. Children often helped with this project, enjoying the tactile satisfaction of squishing soap pieces together. The practice eliminated waste entirely, ensuring that every bit of purchased soap served its purpose. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that throwing away useful material was simply unacceptable when creativity could extend its life. Number 18. Salt-rising bread leavened by wild microbes. This was the loaf that nobody else in Jules Holler could make anymore. She kept a starter going from her grandmother's time, a mash of cornmeal, warm milk, and a pinch of salt, left overnight in a crock wrapped in a wool blanket behind the cook stove. By morning, it smelled sharp, like very ripe cheese, and it hissed faintly when she opened it. That smell meant the wild bacteria, Clostridium perfringens, was alive and working. She did not know the Latin name of the microbe. She knew the crock had to stay at blood temperature, about 104 degrees, for 16 hours or the starter would die. Salt-rising bread has no yeast. It is leavened by hydrogen gas from a wild bacterium found in flour itself, and the technique was invented by pioneer women in these mountains in the 1770s, before yeast was sold in packets at the store. The earliest recorded recipe dates to 1778 in what is now West Virginia. The loaf is dense, white, almost cheesy. Jewel baked 2 a week and traded one to the neighbor who kept her in sorghum. What most people miss is that every woman on Coosa Creek who knew this starter learned it from a woman, back to the Scots-Irish women who carried wheat flour over the Blue Ridge and had no yeast at all. That tradition almost died with Jewel's generation. If your great-grandmother was Appalachian, she likely knew the smell. You can still start one tonight with cornmeal and a warm place to hide it. The tin sat on the back of the stove all year, a squat coffee can or old lard pail filled with pale amber fat that never fully hardened. Every morning after the bacon came off the skillet, she tipped the pan and poured the drippings in, straining out the black bits. You never washed that tin. You never refrigerated it. The fat cycled naturally. Fresh drippings on top, older fat used from the bottom, and it stayed sweet and functional for months without spoiling. It greased the skillet for cornbread. It wilted the lettuce. It finished the green beans. It carried the flavor of every piece of pork that had ever cooked in that kitchen, layered into something richer than any single ingredient could manage. Through the 1930s and 40s, lard came in 50-pound tin pails from the store, but bacon grease was free. It cost nothing but the habit of attention. When she stopped cooking, nobody thought to save the tin. That was the first thing that went. The cold frame sat low against the south wall of the kitchen garden and looked like almost nothing, a rectangle of rot-resistant wood with a salvaged window pane laid at a slight angle to shed rain. But it held a pocket of warmth inside that ran 8 to 12 degrees above the outside air. And in Amish farming communities across Pennsylvania and Ohio, that gap was the difference between fresh greens in April and bare ground. Cold frames let seedlings start 6 weeks earlier than open soil allowed, and they protected late-season kale and spinach through frosts that would otherwise kill them. Amish farmers in Lancaster County were known to harvest sweet corn a full 30 days before neighboring farms using the same variety, partly because of controlled early start techniques. The glass admitted sunlight all day. The wood walls held heat through the night. You propped the lid with a stick on warm afternoons and closed it before dusk. No power. No purchased materials beyond one old pane of glass. 6 extra weeks of harvest on each end of the year. Before anyone drove a horse-drawn scraper across a frozen lake to cut ice blocks for sale, mountain families already had a working cold storage system built into every blizzard, and the ones who understood how to use it properly ate well through storms that left their neighbors desperate. Fresh-killed game wrapped in burlap or hide and packed into a drift on the north side of the cabin, never the south, not even in January, cured in the sustained dry cold the same way a modern walk-in cooler takes days to replicate. Crocks of fresh milk set into packed snow kept 3 to 4 times longer than they'd last indoors. The principle was simple: below freezing, steady, with the meat or crock insulated from direct freeze by the snowpack itself. The rule about the north side was unwritten and non-negotiable. A south-facing drift softened in afternoon sun even in deep January, and softened meat was ruined meat. You didn't need to be told that more than once. The ones who learned it from a lost quarter carcass in October never needed reminding for the rest of their lives. She fed it every morning the way she fed the dog, without thinking, without measuring, just a handful of flour and a splash of water stirred into the crock before the rest of the kitchen woke up. The sourdough starter in some Appalachian homes was older than the women who kept it alive, passed from mother to daughter in a jar wrapped in a dish towel, carried across state lines and guarded like it was worth something, because it was. Before commercial yeast was widely available, that bubbling crock of wild-captured yeast and lactobacillus was the only way to make bread rise. Families in the Smoky Mountains and the Ozarks kept starters going for decades, and the flavor changed depending on the local flour and the bacteria in the air. A starter raised in one hollow tasted different from one in the next. When a young bride left home, she took a piece of the starter with her. When the woman who started it died, the crock stayed on the counter and someone else took over the feeding. The bread kept rising. It just never tasted exactly the same. Vinegar cleaning solutions replaced expensive commercial products throughout Depression-era households. A single bottle of white vinegar diluted with water-cleaned windows, cut grease, sanitized surfaces, removed stains, and deodorized everything from outhouses to kitchens. Adding salt created paste perfect for scrubbing copper pots until they gleamed. Mixed with baking soda, vinegar cleared clogged drains and scoured stubborn buildup from ovens. The sharp smell became synonymous with cleanliness, filling homes on Saturday cleaning days when families prepared for Sunday visitors. Women kept bottles of diluted vinegar, tackling spills immediately. The acid killed mold and mildew, particularly valuable in damp basements where moisture encouraged growth. Some families added dried herbs to vinegar bottles, creating pleasantly scented solutions costing virtually nothing. This hack proved that expensive products offered little advantage over simple chemistry applied with elbow grease. Adding a pinch of coffee grounds to gravy was grandmother's secret weapon for achieving deep, mysterious richness that made Sunday dinners unforgettable. Nobody could identify what made her gravy different: darker, more complex, with savory depth that lingered. A tiny spoonful of unused grounds stirred into pan drippings before adding flour created gravy that tasted like it simmered for hours. Coffee didn't make gravy taste like breakfast. It enhanced meaty, roasted flavors while adding professional-looking color. This worked especially well with beef and pork gravies, where slight bitterness balanced meat-fat richness. Grandma learned it from her mother during hard times when stretching flavor meant stretching resources. The grounds also helped thicken gravy slightly. Modern recipes never mention this addition, leaving cooks wondering why their results taste flat compared to Grandma's legendary version. Cast iron cooking was more than tradition in 1960s kitchens, where heavy black skillets passed down through generations served purposes beyond durability. Women who cooked daily in these pans unknowingly supplemented their families with dietary iron that leached into acidic foods like tomatoes and eggs. Studies now confirm that cooking in cast iron increases iron content by as much as 20 times. The seasoned surface created by years of cooking with lard formed a natural non-stick coating that modern chemists struggle to replicate without harmful compounds. Grandmothers knew never to wash these pans with soap, instead wiping them clean and heating them dry to maintain that precious seasoning. Scientists today recognize this prevented bacterial growth while preserving the polymerized fat layer. The weight distributed heat evenly, eliminating hot spots that burned food in thinner pans. When aluminum and Teflon arrived, promising convenience, Cast iron was dismissed as outdated. Bread bag shoe liners were the secret weapon against wet feet that cost nothing and worked better than store-bought solutions. When rain or snow threatened to soak through worn shoes, mothers would slip plastic bread bags over children's socks before putting their feet into shoes. The plastic created a waterproof barrier that kept feet dry through puddles, slush, and morning dew on the walk to school. This wasn't embarrassing. It was smart. Every family did it because buying new shoes or rubber boots simply wasn't in the budget. The bags were saved, washed, and reused until they fell apart. Children learned to walk carefully to avoid tearing the plastic, and mothers kept a stash of bags near the door during wet seasons. The hack worked so well that some families used it even when they could afford better options. It represented the practical wisdom of making do with what was already in the kitchen drawer. Today's waterproof socks cost $15. Back then, the solution was free and just as effective. Rotten bananas for roses are a fertilizer trick that actually grew to be a really beloved and popular gardening hack. Bananas are something that are rich in potassium and phosphorus, and they help to really promote strong blooms and healthy roots. This is because they're high in all the goody good stuff we've been going over so far, while also being really fast at breaking down. Basically, this is nature's idea of giving your plants a fully organic pick-me-up. It's like caffeine for them, really. The only downside is that it can really draw in pests like fruit flies and ants on the surface. What farmers would do to get around that little disadvantage was they began to make banana tea by soaking the peels in water. They would do this for a few days and then use the liquid as a drench for the soil, and this would help ensure that no rodents were attracted. As good of a trick as this sounds, I'm just not sure. I think I like my bananas too much to spend them on crops. What about you? Would you ever try growing roses with rotten bananas? Or better yet, would you ever try giving someone roses grown by rotten bananas? I know I wouldn't. But hey, that would be a pretty nice little Valentine's gift, or at least a memorable story, right? So what do you think people did with the bread that was left over? Besides using stale bread in imaginative ways such as pudding and porridge, it meant that people used breadcrumbs as fillers too. This was helpful for a number of reasons. First of all, breadcrumbs actually make for an excellent binding agent. They're super good at holding the meat together, and this was necessary for more than a few reasons. You start making these makeshift meatloaves with limited ingredients, and you realize they actually don't hold together that well. Secondly, lots of the things that gave meatloaves their moisture were things like eggs, milk, and a good broth. Of course, milk and eggs were in direly short supply for most households in America during the Depression. Adding breadcrumbs was a way for your meatloaf to still keep some kind of moisture. Also, during the process, breadcrumbs would eventually soften and give the meatloaf a better texture overall. It meant that you only had stale bread without the crumbs, and now you're also going to be having meatloaf with it. Pretty good deal, right? Chilled bowls are actually fantastic for placing your whipping cream in because the cold temperatures here really help in keeping the fat in the cream stable. Why is the stability of the fat of your whipping cream a subject you may want to be invested in? Well, that's because unlike keeping a stable diet or sleep schedule, the effects this time around are a lot more immediate. Whipping cream is made up of a lot of fat molecules that get suspended in the water. That's what happens when you whip the cream. Those molecules start clumping together and make what you see. At room temperature even, this fat can start to melt, and it means you lose the texture of whipping cream when it's at its best. If you chill the bowl though, you don't get this problem because the fat actually stays firm and helps the foam keep its shape. Pretty interesting, right? I know I like my whipping cream at tip-top performance, and if you do too, maybe you want to keep this one in mind. Here's a patty grilling technique endorsed by the culinary virtuoso himself, Gordon Ramsay. You get some nice beef patties perfectly shaped, seasoned, and ready to be slapped onto the grill for the most divine homemade burger you have had in the past 5 years. Turns out it was a bit too humid, the meat was a little dry, and the grilling took away all the moisture. You end up with a dry, chewy patty that does neither your teeth nor your taste buds any favors. So what's an honest burger lover to do? Put some ice cubes on that bad boy and let it grill, you will genuinely be shell-shocked at the results. The whole thing here is that it keeps that moisture locked into the patty, so the burger stays constantly juicy throughout the process, from the moment you put it on the grill to the moment it hits your plate. It is not like you have anything to lose by trying except like 4 ice cubes, so give this a shot. And remember, you can always take Ramsay's word for it too. Salt Ice Cream Maker was a summer hack that turned hot afternoons into frozen treat celebrations without requiring expensive equipment or electricity. Families would nest a small metal can inside a larger bucket, filling the space between with crushed ice and rock salt. The salt lowered the freezing point of the ice, creating temperatures cold enough to freeze cream mixture placed in the inner can. Children took turns cranking or shaking the apparatus, watching through patient labor as liquid transformed into creamy dessert. The process took 30 minutes or more of continuous effort, but the anticipation made the rewards sweeter. Homemade ice cream tasted richer than store-bought versions, made with fresh cream, sugar, and whatever flavorings the family had available. Vanilla extract was common, but summer berries or peaches from the orchard made seasonal variations that became family traditions passed down through generations of hot weather gatherings. Number 21. Sorghum instead of white sugar. Jewel had not bought white sugar since 1951. The farm up the ridge grew sweet sorghum cane, and every October a neighbor ran the cane through a mule-drawn press, then boiled the juice down in a long copper pan over a wood fire for 8 hours. What came out was a dark, earthy syrup with a taste of malt and iron. She traded 4 dozen eggs for a 1-gallon jar, which amounted to about $1.60 in 1955 trade value. That jar sweetened her coffee, cornbread, apple butter, sweet potato pie, and the medicine she gave the children when they coughed. Here is what most people miss. Sorghum has more calcium, more iron, and more potassium than sugar. Jewel did not know the chemistry. She knew the jar lasted 3 months and cost her nothing but eggs. Your grandmother likely had one too, back in the pantry, going dark and sticky. And that was the working rhythm of a hillbilly kitchen. In August, when the pole bean crop came in faster than any one family could handle, the neighbors came. Chairs went out on the porch, wash pans filled with freshly pulled beans, and the work started. Break the tip, pull the string down the pod, snap the bean, drop it in. The sound was specific: a dry snap, a soft rustle, a hollow knock against the tin, hour after hour, set under conversation and children running in the yard. Bean stringing days were documented as community cooperative events across Appalachia as far back as the early 1900s. Women brought their best stories to bean stringing days. Some of those conversations are the last clear memory certain families hold of grandmothers now gone. Her voice, the smell of the beans, the weight of the pan. The beans went into jars or leather breeches or that night's supper. The day those hands made together was harder to put up. The rafters of the summer kitchen held more medicine than most pharmacies stocked in winter, if you knew how to read what was hanging there. Bundles of dried yarrow, ropes of braided garlic, stalks of peppermint tied at the stems, mullein leaves spread on a rack for the lung troubles that came with cold air. Every Amish household maintained an herb corner, a dedicated patch of the kitchen garden where plants that handled common ailments were grown, harvested before frost, and hung upside down in the driest space available. You dried them without heat so the volatile oils stayed in the leaf. Yarrow, Acacia millefolium, stopped minor bleeding when the fresh leaf was pressed directly onto a cut, which is why it appeared in Amish field kits for generations. Peppermint eased stomach cramps as a tea. Lavender calmed the children who wouldn't settle. The women who kept these bundles knew each plant by smell before they knew its name. That knowledge passed from mother to daughter through touch and observation. What remained when the last woman who held it was gone was a bundle of dried stems nobody could use anymore. Every autumn, before the first hard freeze, the barrel came out and the salting began. And the family that skipped this in a warm October was the family on its knees in a cold root cellar in February, trying to make what little was left last another 6 weeks. Pork cuts, shoulders, belly, fat back, went in rubbed with coarse salt and saltpeter, the potassium nitrate that held off bacterial growth and kept the meat from going gray in the brine. Water, more salt, and sometimes a pour of molasses went in over the top. A weighted wooden disc kept everything submerged. From that barrel came the salt pork that flavored nearly every winter meal, crumbled into dried beans, fried out for drippings before any other cooking began, laid over hardtack in the skillet. Families knew by mid-February whether they'd put up enough in October. Some years the math held, some years it didn't, and you learned to count more carefully the following fall. A pinch of salt in the coffee grounds before the water went through. That was the trick. And if you knew it, you learned it from someone who drank bad coffee for a long time before figuring it out. The salt did not make the coffee taste salty. It suppressed the bitter compounds released when cheap coffee or a percolator pushed water past the grounds too many times. In mountain kitchens where coffee was boiled in an open pot, that bitterness was unavoidable, and the salt took the edge off without adding sugar most families could not spare. Navy veterans from the Second World War brought the trick home from mess halls where the coffee was notoriously harsh, and it spread through small towns and rural diners across the South through the 1950s. Sodium ions block the taste receptors that detect bitterness, which is why a pinch improves almost anything bitter. But nobody in those kitchens needed the science. They just needed the coffee to stop tasting like punishment. Flour sack clothing transformed humble cotton bags into dresses, shirts, curtains, and quilts that clothed entire families through the darkest Depression years. Manufacturers eventually printed colorful patterns on their sacks, knowing housewives chose brands based on fabric designs they could repurpose. Women purchased flour based on matching patterns, collecting enough sacks to create coordinated outfits. The cotton was surprisingly soft after washing, often more comfortable than store-bought fabric costing far more than families could afford. Grandmothers taught younger women to remove printed labels by soaking sacks in lye water, scrubbing until cotton emerged clean and ready for cutting. A single 100-pound flour sack yielded enough material for a child's dress or 2 dish towels. The stitching required skill, but seeing children clothed in bright fabric made the work worthwhile. This hack represented dignity maintained through creativity when everything else seemed to crumble. Cast iron seasoning secrets were guarded knowledge that grandmothers demonstrated through decades of daily cooking rather than explaining outright. Those black skillets, passed down through generations, developed surfaces so slick that eggs slid around without a drop of oil needed. Grandma never used soap on her cast iron, just hot water, a stiff brush, and immediate drying over a warm burner to prevent rust. After every use, she rubbed a thin layer of lard across the entire surface while still warm, building layers of polymerized fat that created natural non-stick protection better than any factory coating. She knew acidic foods could strip seasoning and cook tomatoes elsewhere. She understood slow heating prevented warping. These skillets outlasted every fancy coated pan stores sell, working better each passing year. The tragedy is how many perfectly seasoned pieces sit neglected in estate sales because new generations never learned their proper care. Vinegar cleaning solutions dominated 1960s households where thrifty homemakers mixed white vinegar with water for everything from windows to floors without reaching for commercial products. This simple acid cut through grease and grime while leaving surfaces streak-free in ways expensive cleaners often failed to match. Modern testing confirms that vinegar's acetic acid kills common bacteria, including E. coli and Salmonella, validating what grandmothers knew from experience. The solution was safe around children and pets, leaving no toxic residues on surfaces where food was prepared. Windows cleaned with vinegar and newspaper dried without filmy residue that commercial sprays left behind. The sharp smell dissipated quickly, unlike synthetic fragrances that triggered allergies. Homemakers added essential oils like lemon for pleasant scents while boosting antibacterial properties. When aerosol sprays flooded shelves, vinegar retreated to salad dressings. Scientists warn many commercial cleaners contain harmful chemicals. Coffee grounds, reusing stretched morning routines across multiple days. When buying fresh grounds meant choosing between coffee and other necessities. Families would brew their grounds twice, sometimes 3 times, accepting progressively weaker cups rather than waste any potential flavor. The first brew was reserved for working adults who needed strength for labor. The second brew went to older children or was mixed with chicory to maintain body. Used grounds found second lives beyond the pot, spread in gardens as fertilizer, used to scrub greasy pans, or scattered to deter pests from doorways. Some families dried and stored used grounds, mixing them half and half with fresh grounds to double their supply. The weaker coffee became normal, and children grew up not knowing any different. This wasn't about taste preferences, it was about mathematics. 1 can of coffee lasting 3 weeks instead of 1 meant money for other essentials. The grounds never went to trash until every possible use had been extracted. Urine as a natural fertilizer is probably the most ancient technique across this entire list. It's also one that has an immense amount of scientific proof to help back it up. This is sterile, nutrient-rich and free, and it's high as the sky in everything a plant needs. Urine contains, well, urea. Who names these things? Anyway, the urea eventually breaks down into ammonia, and that helps to act as this really abundant source of nitrogen, which, as you know, really makes sure those leaves grow just the way they need to. Then, urine also has a decent amount of phosphorus and potassium, and it's also fast-acting, but you can't just zip down and start peeing on your tomato plant. You have to dilute it 1/10 with water, otherwise you would burn the plants, and it has to be fresh. It's best for leafy greens, and you're supposed to apply it directly to the soil. Also, this wasn't exactly the most popular trick. A lot of gardeners really looked at you funny for doing this. Apparently, there was a lot of social stigma, and I get it. Who would want to eat pissy cabbage? I mean, come on, there just has to be a better way. So, the next on our list is victory gardens, which I promised you we would talk about. When you think of the phrase victory garden, you might start to think about a bountiful paradise full of fresh harvests and the scent of liberty and conquest. However, this is exactly the opposite of what these are. Victory gardens were basically a band-aid solution that really helped people get by. These opened up an entirely new world of food for people, and their chances of actually being able to support all the mouths in their households opened up phenomenally. In their backyards, people had decided that they would start planting whatever kinds of crops they basically could, from stuff like celery, turnips, onions, garlic, and potatoes, to even things like corn. It meant that people could actually do 2 things properly once again. They could eat somewhat and find lots of vegetables and herbs to put in their food. Secondly, bartering had made a return in the modern era. After literally centuries since its last appearance, people actually began to trade items with one another for security. A few cloves of garlic in exchange for a ragged shoe, some extra lace and cloth in exchange for a potato, some hand-me-downs in exchange for celery. This was the common way of life for people back then. So this one might really be a wonder for you, but it actually does work, both in theory and execution. Using bread to revive hardened sugar is a classic kitchen hack that basically just plays around a little bit with science to get some much-needed utility in the kitchen. So, people weren't just using sugar, they had substituted it with brown sugar, and that really was prone to hardening a lot. It wasn't good at keeping its moisture, especially since brown sugar had a decent amount of molasses. Those had water content, but it would pretty much evaporate and cause the bits of sugar to lump together. Now, the issue here seems to be that we don't have enough water to keep things going around here, right? Bread, conveniently enough, has an incredible amount of water content. The moisture in bread is around 35 to 45%, and when you put that up against hardened sugar, the difference comparatively is immense. The process by which you take advantage of all this is called diffusion. It helps water molecules move from a densely packed surface like the bread to a place that's missing water. Think of it like a revive in a Call of Duty game. Once you put that bread in an airtight container with the sugar, the vapor the bread gives off naturally starts diffusing into the sugar, and that in turn softens. Pretty neat, right? Sometimes your fridge gets a due date for the scrapyard much earlier than it should. Sometimes the gas runs out and you are left debating a crisis. Do I let all my frozen stuff, my protein, and my milk go to waste? Or do I take some inspiration from my ancestors and try a neat little milk preservation hack? The next time you find yourself on the edge of a dairy disaster, try placing your bottled milk in a bowl of cold water. This next step is baby levels of difficulty. All you need is a wet cloth placed around the edges. Gets rid of those nasty bacteria, gets rid of your milk gone stale worries. We think it is an all-around win-win. Clothespin chip clip was a simple repurposing that kept opened food packages sealed and fresh using wooden pins designed for hanging laundry. Families discovered that the spring-loaded grip, perfect for securing clothes to lines, worked equally well for folding over bag openings. Chip bags, cereal boxes, and flour sacks stayed fresher longer when clipped shut, preventing staleness and keeping pests out of pantry goods. The wooden clothespins were already present in every household, requiring no additional purchase for this secondary function. Children learned to clip bags closed after snacking, developing habits of food preservation that prevented waste. The pins could be dedicated to kitchen use or shared between laundry and pantry duties without any problems. This hack represented the mountain understanding that simple tools often served multiple purposes when people thought creatively about their possessions. Number 14. Eggshells dropped into the coffee pot. Jewel drank her coffee strong and clear. She used a blue enamel percolator on the cook stove, coarse ground Louisiane that cost 31 cents a pound, and a trick her grandmother had taught her back in 1910. After she scooped the grounds into the basket, she crushed one clean eggshell in her fist and tossed it on top of the grounds. The albumin in the shell bound the grounds together and pulled them to the bottom of the pot. The alkaline calcium carbonate cut the bitter edge off the acid. The coffee came out smooth and amber, not muddy. An egg a week was a cheap price for clear coffee. This was a working trick every cattle drive cook in the West used in the 1880s. The mountain women had it too, and they used it without knowing it was famous. The shell went in the scrap bucket and fed the chickens. Your grandmother's coffee may have tasted better than yours for this reason. Soup beans were started before anyone else was awake. The pintos had soaked overnight, and by the time the kitchen was light enough to see, she had a piece of fatback already browning in the bottom of the pot. Water in to cover, lid on low, and the beans cooked all morning without anyone being asked to watch. She knew by the smell when they were getting close. Soup beans were Monday food in most Appalachian households. The anchor of the week, something you could eat twice in a day without complaint because the pot just got better as the hours went on. By the 1950s, pinto beans ran around 14 cents a pound at the company store, and a pound could feed a family of 6 if the cornbread was thick. The beans went into the bowl, and the cornbread went in beside them. You used the bread to push the beans onto the spoon because that was the right way, and everyone knew it without being told. The variations were as personal as handwriting, and hers was the only one that tasted right. Pressure canning meat was the insurance policy on every Amish pantry shelf. Rows of glass pint jars holding pork shoulder, beef, and chicken that stayed shelf-stable for 12 to 18 months without electricity. Low-acid foods like meat could only be safely processed in a pressure canner, heated to at least 240 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature no water bath could reach. You packed raw meat into sterilized jars and ran the process. Chicken took a minimum of 3 hours. Martha Stutzman, canning at the Green Dragon Market in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, said she always used fresh lids for meat, because after 3 hours of processing, she couldn't afford a seal to fail. When the rows gleamed on the shelf, she looked at them and felt ready for whatever came next. Those rows are gone from most kitchens now. The skill went with the women who held it. Nobody called it skilly galley on a good day. That name came out only when things were desperate enough to admit what you were actually eating. Hardtack was 3 ingredients: flour, water, salt, baked so long and low that every trace of moisture baked out, and the result could sit in a haversack for years. Civil War soldiers were rationed 9 squares per day, and eating in the dark was a blessing. In the dark, you couldn't see the weevils floating in your coffee cup after you'd crumbled the biscuit in to soften it. The mountain man's fix was simpler. Render pork fat in cast iron until it shimmered, drop the hardtack in until it soaked up the grease and went golden at the edges, and what came off the fire resembled a pancake with no right to taste as good as it did. John Billings named the technique skilly-gally in his 1887 memoir, Hardtack and Coffee. The men who ate it called it supper. Civil War hardtack, still displayed in museums, is theoretically edible after 160 years. Not one person has volunteered to confirm that. If you put soap on the skillet, you might as well have cursed in church. That was how seriously the old cooks took their cast iron. Instead of detergent, they grabbed a handful of coarse salt, poured it into the still warm pan, and scrubbed with a folded rag or a cut potato half. The salt acted as a gentle abrasive, lifting stuck-on food without stripping the seasoning built up over years. Kosher salt worked best because of its larger crystals, but in mountain kitchens where it was not available, they used rock salt or fine sand from the creek bed. After scrubbing, the pan was rinsed quickly, never soaked, dried over the stove's heat, and wiped with a thin coat of lard before it went back on the hook. That thin layer of fat sealed the pores of the iron, preventing rust and adding another coat to the black, glassy surface that made the pan practically non-stick. Soap was not forbidden out of superstition. The old lye-based soaps genuinely stripped seasoning, and they knew what they were protecting. Potato water starch gave families crisp, pressed clothing without spending money on commercial products. After boiling potatoes for dinner, the cloudy cooking water was saved and strained into jars. This starchy liquid, sprinkled onto fabric before ironing, created the same crisp finish that expensive store-bought starch provided. Shirts emerged with sharp collars, dresses with structured pleats, and tablecloths with professional crispness. The technique required practice. Too much potato water left fabric stiff, while too little failed to provide adequate body. Women learned to test concentration by feel, adjusting based on the weight of different fabrics. Some families kept potato water in ice boxes, though most used it fresh within a day before it soured. Sunday mornings often began with the smell of heated irons pressing starch into church clothes. This hack represented determination to maintain dignity even when poverty threatened to strip away pride. Butter wrappers saved for greasing pans represented Grandma's understanding that nothing useful should ever hit the trash bin. Every time she unwrapped butter, that waxy paper went into a refrigerator container, accumulating until needed. When pans required greasing, Grandma rubbed residual butter across surfaces with perfect economy. The thin coating was exactly right, enough to prevent sticking without excess fat making baked goods greasy or cookies spread too thin. Children learned to save wrappers automatically. The practice meant never dirtying a brush or wasting whole butter pats on greasing duties. Those wrappers worked better than cooking sprays because they left no chemical aftertaste and created even coverage. During wartime rationing, when butter was precious, this became essential survival knowledge. Today, we throw away perfectly good wrappers without a second thought. Oatmeal baths soothed irritated skin in the 1960s households where mothers filled cloth bags with plain oats and swirled them in warm bath water for children suffering from chicken pox, poison ivy, or eczema. The milky water provided relief that seemed almost magical to families who could not afford specialized medications. Modern dermatology has validated this practice, identifying compounds called avenanthramides in oats that reduce inflammation and itching at the cellular level. The colloidal suspension created when oats release their starches forms a protective film on skin that locks in moisture. Pharmaceutical companies now sell colloidal oatmeal products at premium prices that grandmothers achieved with pantry staples. The treatment was gentle enough for infants and effective enough for adults with chronic skin conditions. When medicated lotions became available, oatmeal baths seemed like primitive home remedies. Scientists now recommend them as first-line treatment for many skin conditions. Egg carton seed starters transformed breakfast packaging into springtime nurseries that launched gardens without spending money on commercial planters. Each cup in a cardboard egg carton became a perfect container for starting seeds indoors before transplanting season. Families filled cups with soil, planted seeds, and placed cartons in sunny windows where warmth encouraged germination. The cardboard retained moisture while allowing drainage, and when seedlings grew strong, entire cups could be planted directly in ground where they decomposed naturally. The system cost nothing beyond seeds, often saved from previous harvests, and soil from the yard. Children participated eagerly, watching assigned cups for first sprouts and learning patience alongside botany. The practice extended growing seasons and gave families head starts on vegetables that would feed them through summer. Egg cartons that would otherwise become trash became tools for food production, embodying the principle that everything had potential use. Molasses in the past weren't just used for syrups. Lots of practices thought they were a natural soil amendment, and they helped to feed beneficial microbes and basically boost overall plant health. It gave the crops a shot of a few things they really needed, like carbohydrates, trace minerals, organic compounds, and more. All of these things were really beneficial for the soil because they helped to really elevate microbial activity. You'd boost beneficial microbes because those were the ones you wanted to be attracting, and the sugar in molasses really did that. It also helped to make the soil stronger and gave it a lot of micronutrients it needed. Just a tablespoon or two of unsulfured molasses was enough to do the trick, but the downsides were that overuse wouldn't just have the opposite effect, i.e. promoting growth of microbes that you don't need, but it would also attract ants and other kinds of rodents and pests if you happen to spill it on the leaves. Now, this is a serious problem. You might think that it's just a spill, but that scent really carries, and if they do come and munch on your stuff while you're asleep, you're going to regret it badly. You know, I don't think the American people truly grasp just how much of a solid bro molasses they have been to us throughout the entirety of this country's tenured history. The Depression also had the benefit of being paired next to some of the worst things to happen in documented human history. I'm talking about ecological terror from the Dust Bowl, back-to-back modern warfare, the likes of which had never been seen in 2 world wars, and mass unemployment. It meant that people had to cut meat out of their lives almost entirely and substitute it with things like lentils and beans. Can you imagine an America where there really is no meat for you to get? Not in the stores, not from your neighbors, not even scraps left at the bottom of a can? It seems like some lucid nightmare that you may have dreamt up after a bender, doesn't it? Yet that was exactly the reality people were living with. Most good or even average cuts of meat had been stored away and rationed for soldiers during the war effort. They vacuumed protein, all those troops. Besides that, the prices for meat in general also skyrocketed beyond belief. Lots of people just weren't in the tax bracket that could afford its own poultry, game, and protein anymore. They adapted in other ways besides lentils and beans, but these natural resources saved dinner time for many people. Salt is really good at quickly cleaning your iron pans. This happens for a few reasons, but 2 of them are that salt just happens to be inherently very abrasive, and it's also very good at degreasing. This helps food that's stuck on the pan and any grease that also won't go away to come off easily. You don't want to be damaging the surface of your pan after all. Why is salt like that, though? Salt happens to be really coarse, and that makes it really good for situations where you would need an abrasive. Sprinkle just a little bit on a hot pan with a bit of leftover oil and start scrubbing with a cloth. You'll see the difference almost immediately, and that's all thanks to the coarseness of salt. Why does salt work as a degreaser? Well, that's because when you use it alongside heat, salt changes its properties a little, as most things do when they come into contact with heat. Now, salt can help to absorb and break down greasy surfaces because it helps draw that grease away. Salt has a lot of good absorption properties too. It's really good at taking away moisture from other liquids and oils. It's also good for preventing some rust, but that's a little side tip I'm including for free. Something that is ridiculously common in Southeast Asian households in America, but a little less known to natives of Uncle Sam's residence, is that rinsing your rice with water can do wonders for any dish. Literally, any dish that involves even the slightest hint of rice. This is because rinsing removes the extra starch packed into rice, giving you fluffier grains with minimal effort. If you are the type of person who enjoys their rice soft, airy, and mushy, then this is one kitchen hack you need to try. This time, you can thank brown grandmas for passing it on to the mainstream. Even culinary scientists like Matt Slem vouch for this, and just like with sticky pasta, nobody enjoys eating sticky rice. Potato rust remover was a surprisingly effective tool for restoring rusted cast iron, knife blades, and metal implements to working condition. The technique involved cutting a raw potato in half, dipping the cut surface into dish soap or salt, then using it to scrub rusted metal surfaces. The oxalic acid naturally present in potatoes reacted with iron oxide, loosening rust and allowing it to be wiped away easily. Families discovered this hack when polishing their precious cast iron skillets, the cornerstones of mountain cooking that needed regular maintenance to stay functional. The potato provided gentle abrasion without scratching seasoned surfaces, making it safer than steel wool or harsh chemicals that could damage the pan's coating. Children were often assigned this task, working through collections of rusty tools and kitchen implements on Saturday mornings. The method was slow but effective, requiring patience as the potato gradually broke down rust layer by layer. Number 19. Self-rising flour mixed at home from plain flour. The town store in Blairsville sold Martha White self-rising flour for 22 cents, more a bag than plain flour. Jewel did the math. She bought plain white lily flour in 25-pound sacks and mixed her own every Monday morning. 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of salt for every cup of flour. She blended it in a crock and kept it covered on the pantry shelf. Over a year, the savings added up to a pair of work boots, which in 1955 ran $7.95 at the Sears catalog. Nobody in town talked about it, because the women who did it had been taught by grandmothers who could not always read a label. They were not about to pay someone else for something they could mix in a crock. It is still the simplest hack you can teach your daughter in under 2 minutes. The lettuce had to be fresh, still cool from the garden, because the whole point was the contrast. You filled a wash pan with torn green leaf lettuce and thin-sliced spring onions, salted it light, and went to the skillet. The grease had to be smoking. Not warm, not hot, smoking, with a shimmer past ready. You poured it straight over the raw greens in one long stream, moving slow so the heat reached every corner, and the lettuce collapsed on contact with a hiss, wilting to 1/3 of its volume in seconds. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in next, and sometimes crumbled bacon across the top. Kilt lettuce appeared on Appalachian tables from late March through late May in Harlan County and across the Kentucky mountains when the new garden was coming in and the winter's preserved food was finally running thin. She made it in a wash pan big enough for the whole family and served it piping hot. Nobody has gotten the pour right since she left. The root cellar was never just a hole in the ground. Every family that kept one knew the temperature varied by as much as 15 degrees depending on where you stood, and that knowledge was worth more than any pantry shelf. The coldest zone, pressed against the north-facing stone wall at floor level, was where carrots and parsnips went, packed in slightly damp sand to keep them from shriveling. The middle zone held potatoes and cabbages, which needed cool air but not the biting cold that turned a potato black. The warmest corner, near the door where drafts crept in, was where onions and garlic hung in braided ropes, needing airflow more than cold to stay dry. You learned it by watching her carry the baskets down in October, choosing the spot for each without hesitation. By February, when everything outside was frozen and buried, that cellar still held enough to feed a family of 8 for 3 more months. Most people today have never felt what it means to open that door in the dead of winter and see food enough to survive. Pemmican was the closest thing to a miracle food the Rocky Mountains ever produced, and the Cree people who invented it weren't sharing the formula with just anyone. The process took days. Thin strips of bison dried in the hot sun until brittle, then pounded between flat stones into a coarse powder barely recognizable as meat. Rendered tallow went in equal measure by weight, warm and liquid, sometimes with dried choke cherries or Saskatoon berries crushed fine. The mixture was packed into rawhide bags while still hot, compressed as it cooled, the bags sewn shut. What came out was a calorie brick that wouldn't freeze, wouldn't spoil, and could sustain a trapper through 2 weeks of blizzard on nothing else. The demand for it triggered the Pemmican War of 1814 between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, fighting over the Red River supply. You needed 5 pounds of fresh meat to make 1 pound of finished pemmican. The math alone told you everything about the patience it required. When the hens stopped laying and the butter money ran out, the cake still got made. because somebody's grandmother figured out that vinegar and baking soda could do the work of eggs if you let the chemistry happen fast enough. They called it wacky cake in parts of the Ozarks and crazy cake in the Appalachian foothills, and the recipe spread through church bulletins and hand-copied index cards during the 1930s when rationing made eggs and dairy unpredictable. You mixed the dry ingredients right in the baking pan: flour, sugar, cocoa, salt, baking soda, then poured vinegar, vegetable oil, and cold water over the top and stirred with a fork until the batter foamed and rose. No bowl to wash, no eggs to crack, no butter to soften. The vinegar reacted with the soda to produce carbon dioxide, and the bubbles gave the crumb its lift. What came out of the oven was dark, moist, and tender. Not a compromise, not a substitute, but a cake that earned its place at the table on its own terms. Bread bag ironing solved the problem of wrinkled clothes without expensive spray starch or steam irons. Families saved waxed paper bags from store-bought bread, using them as pressing cloths when ironing delicate fabrics. The slight wax coating prevented scorching while allowing heat to smooth wrinkles. More importantly, families learned to dampen clothes by sprinkling them with water, rolling them tightly, then storing them inside bread bags overnight. The sealed environment allowed moisture to distribute evenly throughout fabric, making ironing faster the next morning. Children often helped with sprinkling and rolling, learning household skills serving them throughout their lives. Some women sprinkled clothes Saturday night, letting them sit until Monday's ironing session. The bread bags were reused dozens of times before wearing out. This hack exemplified the Depression-era mindset that nothing should serve only one purpose when creativity could multiply value. The bread heel trick for keeping brown sugar soft was grandmother's clever solution that cost nothing but solved everything. Brown sugar turned into a brick within days of opening, requiring a hammer to break apart. Grandma simply dropped a bread heel, the end piece nobody wanted anyway, into the container and sealed it tight. Within hours, rock-hard sugar transformed into soft, scoopable sweetness. Bread released moisture slowly, rehydrating the molasses coating without making sugar wet or clumpy. This hack turned kitchen scraps into problem solvers, using unwanted bread ends children pushed aside. Some grandmothers used apple slices or orange peels instead, adding subtle flavor while restoring texture. The trick worked for weeks, keeping sugar ready for cookies and oatmeal. Modern cooks buy expensive terracotta discs, never knowing a simple bread heel could solve the problem. Newspaper window cleaning was standard practice in the 1960s households where women achieved crystal-clear glass without purchasing specialized products or paper towels. The technique involved crumpling newspaper pages and using them with vinegar solution to wipe windows until they sparkled without streaks. Modern materials scientists explain this worked because newspaper ink contained carbon black and petroleum oils that polished glass while dense fibers absorbed moisture without leaving threads. The slightly abrasive texture removed stubborn spots cloth alone could not eliminate. This method cost essentially nothing since newspapers were household staples purchased for content, then repurposed. Cleaning professionals today still recommend this technique for professional results without expensive tools. The shift to digital news and concerns about ink transfer led homemakers to abandon newspaper cleaning for paper towels. Scientists confirm the old method remains superior for streak-free results requiring no chemical additives. Soap sliver pressing was the bathroom alchemy that ensured no fragment of purchased soap ever went to waste. When bar soap wore down to thin slivers too small to grip, families collected these scraps in jars kept near the sink. Once enough accumulated, mothers would wet the slivers and press them together firmly, molding them into new usable bars. Some heated the scraps in small amounts of water, then poured the mixture into molds to create uniform bars. Others simply pressed wet slivers onto new bars, fusing them together. Children learned this practice young, understanding that throwing away even the smallest soap piece meant wasting precious money. The recycled bars worked just as well as new ones, lathering and cleaning without any difference. This hack represented the fundamental philosophy of waste, nothing that governed poor households. A single purchased bar could effectively become 2 or 3 through careful sliver collection. The practice saved pennies that accumulated into dollars over months of bathroom thrift. Now, burying fish scraps is a practice that literally goes back several centuries. It was most commonly used by indigenous people in the North Americas, and then later it was something that settlers started adopting. The idea here is basically that while decomposing, the nutrients that a fish's corpse releases are extremely essential to plants. They have stuff like calcium, phosphorus, and nitrogen, which are really vital for healthy leaf growth, better root development, stable flowering, and just a stronger plant all around. Why does this work though? I mean, sure, I just told you why, but what's really going on behind the scenes here? See, when the fish breaks down, it begins to release nutrients. This means it works like an extended release fertilizer, all free from Mother Nature. This process also helps boost microbial activity, which means that whatever microbes the soil needs, it has a better chance of getting them. People would bury their fish 12 inches deep into the soil so that they were safe from local wildlife, pair it with compost, and use entire fish bodies instead of just a few parts. You had to really bury deep because otherwise that smell would carry for miles and bring all sorts of rodents and pests to your crops. Have you ever seen those posts on Instagram about what's a blessing or a privilege we don't talk about? I think having stews with proper ingredients is one. If you look at the Depression, these basic ingredients that we probably take for granted became so hard to get that people began to stretch all of their stews with water or flour wherever they could. These makeshift stews were the backbone of what kept most people going during the Depression, because they took the one resource that was still free and mostly available: water. If the crux of your dish is water, then it becomes a lot easier to prepare for a lot of people. Naturally, people were migrating from all sorts of places to live with their relatives in times like this too. It meant that people, for once, had to really think outside the box to see how they could get a dish done. It wasn't easy, and to be honest, by technical standards, they weren't really stews. Throw in some vegetables though, and they become a meal that can feed an entire family at least. The next thing people discovered that really worked was using wax paper for sticking food to pans. So the normal way to do things was to basically just grease as much as you could with lard or butter. Naturally, people would start using parchment paper sooner or later, but that was more so a modern trend. Back in the 20th century, people began to use wax paper at the bottom of pans so that they could stick food. Honestly, it helped bakers at home a lot. It was much more affordable than the alternatives, and it helped to keep other things people would often use for greasing pans from running low. It became such a top dog in the baking world that it pretty much took out heavy greasing as a method entirely. One of the most widespread hacks that got around like wildfire in the USA was the idea of speeding up the process of caramelizing onions by adding in some baking soda. Baking soda is a handy tool for many tasks, like softening vegetables or removing pesky stains. In the case of onions, it creates a pretty volatile pH environment, which helps the onions brown faster, better, and with a much richer flavor. This has to do with onions being more alkaline post-baking soda, and that really helps speed up the browning process. If you want to cut down on the prep time of your food without sacrificing the taste, and you find yourself putting in caramelized onions a lot, then this is one hack from Grandma to us to you. Bacon grease lamp was an emergency lighting solution that turned kitchen waste into functional illumination when kerosene ran low or power lines failed. Families saved rendered bacon fat in metal cans, knowing it could serve double duty beyond cooking. The process involved pouring the solidified grease into a shallow dish, then inserting a twisted cotton rag or piece of string as a wick. Once lit, the grease burned slowly with a steady yellow flame that could illuminate a room for hours. The light wasn't bright, but it was enough for evening chores, reading, or navigating dark hallways during storms. The smell was distinctive, a smoky bacon aroma that filled the house, but families considered it preferable to sitting in darkness. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that nothing should be wasted when it could serve another purpose. Many households kept a dedicated bacon grease lamp ready throughout winter months when storms frequently knocked out electricity. Number 23. Leather britches beans strung on thread. In late August of 1955, the green beans came in by the bushel, and Jewel could not can them all. The glass jars cost money. Lids were still rationed in her memory from the war. So she sat on the cabin porch with a tin bowl of half-runner beans, a sewing needle, and a length of white cotton thread. She ran the needle through the middle of each bean and slid it down the thread like a bead. A full string held 100 beans. She hung the strings from the rafters of the cabin loft, out of the sun, and let them shrivel for 6 weeks. They looked like small leather breeches that had been soaked and dried. Back then, every cabin in Union County had strings of them swinging in the loft. Come January, she dropped a handful into a pot with fatback and water and simmered them 4 hours. Supper cost nothing but time. A quart jar of canned beans cost 14 cents, but leather breeches cost 0. Multiply by 40 supper nights and you see why she strung them every year. The ones who did not know the preparation could have killed themselves. Pokeweed, the tall-stalked plant with dark purple berries that grew wild along Appalachian roadsides, contained phytolactotoxin through every part of its structure. Eating it raw or undercooked caused vomiting, convulsions, and in documented cases, death. But the people who knew understood that young spring leaves, harvested when the plant was still under a foot high, could be made safe through a preparation that could not be shortened. You brought a pot to a full rolling boil, added the leaves, cooked 15 minutes, and drained every drop. Fresh water back to the boil, cook again, drain again. Fresh water a third time, cook, drain. Only after 3 full cycles did the greens go into the skillet with bacon grease and onion, with scrambled egg folded in at the end. Salad was the Old English word for cooked greens, carried into Appalachian speech by early settlers. The dish was celebrated each June at the Polk Salad Festival in Harlan, Kentucky. You could only earn it by knowing what nobody had written down. Not everything the Amish preserved started in the field. Some of it started in a bucket of beet juice and a dozen hard-boiled eggs left to sit for 2 weeks until the white had gone deep purple all the way through. Red beet eggs were a Lancaster County staple that most people outside Pennsylvania have never encountered, and those who grew up with them never forgot the color. That startling wine red when you cracked the jar, the smell of vinegar and sweet beet coming with it. You boiled the beet liquid with water, sugar, and vinegar, slipped the peeled eggs in with whole beets on top, and waited. 2 weeks minimum. The eggs absorbed the sweetness and the sharpness together, turning plain hard-boiled into something you'd eat straight from the jar at the counter. They kept for 3 to 4 months once sealed. The jar was always on the Easter table, always at the reunion, always at the church potluck. And then, one year, it just wasn't. Boudin was the Rocky Mountain delicacy that would stop a modern dinner guest cold before they took a single bite. Boudins were sections of fresh buffalo intestine, cleaned and turned inside out, stuffed with chopped liver, kidney fat, and wild onions, then tied off and roasted directly over a fire until the casing blistered and split, and the fat ran into the coals with a sizzle that turned heads across camp. Osborne Russell recorded in his 1835 journal that the men ate them with something close to reverence, not because they had no options, but because properly made boudins were genuinely, surprisingly good. The fat inside basted the organ meat from within while the smoke worked through the outer skin. The charred exterior gave way to something tender and rich that no cured meat could replicate. The parts nobody wanted off a kill became the parts everyone fought over at the fire. The butter was dear, and it almost always was. The trick was to stretch it. You took a 1/4 pound of butter, softened it to room temperature, then whipped it with a fork or a wooden spoon while slowly adding 2 or 3 tablespoons of cold water and a pinch of salt. The water emulsified into the fat, increasing the volume by nearly 1/3 without changing the taste enough for anyone to notice on a hot biscuit or a slab of cornbread. Depression-era households across the rural South and Midwest used this trick to make a single pound of butter last the week, and some added a splash of evaporated milk instead of water for a creamier result. The salt masked the slight dilution and helped preserve the spread in kitchens without reliable refrigeration. It was not a recipe. It was math. The math of making less feel like enough. And the woman who did it never told anyone at the table that the butter was different, because pride mattered as much as the meal. Homemade tooth powder kept families' teeth clean when commercial toothpaste cost precious pennies better spent on food. The basic recipe combined baking soda with salt in roughly equal proportions, creating an effective cleanser that removed food particles and freshened breath. Some families added dried powdered sage leaves for flavor and cleaning properties, while others mixed in drops of peppermint oil when available. The powder was stored in small tins, with each family member dipping a dampened toothbrush into the mixture. The slightly salty, alkaline taste took getting used to, but the results were undeniable. Teeth stayed clean and breath stayed fresh without monthly purchases. Children learned to make their own tooth powder, understanding that self-sufficiency extended even to daily hygiene. Some households shared a single tin, while others gave each person their own supply. This hack kept dental health manageable when dentist visits were unthinkable luxuries. A potato in oversalted soup was Grandma's emergency rescue for dishes that seemed ruined beyond repair. When a heavy hand with the salt shaker turned tonight's dinner into a sodium disaster, she didn't panic or start over. Instead, she peeled a raw potato, cut it into chunks, and dropped them into the simmering pot for 15 to 20 minutes. The potato absorbed excess salt like a sponge, pulling the harsh flavor out of the broth while adding subtle starch that improved the soup's body. Once the potato chunks turned translucent and soft, she fished them out and discarded them, leaving behind a perfectly balanced soup. This trick worked for stews, sauces, and any liquid-based dish that had gone too salty. The science was simple absorption, but the result felt like kitchen magic. Grandma kept this remedy ready because mistakes happened, and throwing away food was never an option when budgets were tight and groceries didn't come easy. Copper cookware lined kitchen walls in 1960s homes where serious cooks understood this metal conducted heat more evenly than any alternative. The antimicrobial properties of copper, though not understood then, provided additional benefit that modern science has documented extensively. Studies confirm bacteria, viruses, and fungi die rapidly on copper surfaces through contact killing that destroys pathogens within minutes. The responsive heat conductivity allowed cooks to adjust temperature instantly, preventing scorched sauces. French culinary tradition relied on copper for centuries, knowledge American homemakers adopted when French cooking became fashionable. The maintenance required was considerable, demanding regular polishing to prevent tarnish. When stainless steel and non-stick coatings arrived promising easier care, copper retreated to decorative status. Scientists now install copper surfaces in hospitals to reduce infection rates, validating kitchen intuition of generations past. Tin can. Reusing turned kitchen trash into household essentials that served dozens of purposes. Empty cans became drinking cups, storage containers, cookie cutters, candle holders, and planters. Larger cans stored flour, sugar, and dried beans. Smaller cans held buttons, screws, and sewing notions. Some families hammered holes in bottoms to create colanders or punched decorative patterns for lanterns. Coffee cans with plastic lids became standard storage systems in pantries and workshops. Children used tin cans for stilts, telephones connected by string, and targets for throwing games. The sharp edges were bent inward or covered with tape to prevent cuts. Families accumulated collections organized by size, knowing each can would eventually find purpose. What stores sold as specialty containers, poor households created from what arrived free with their food. The practice represented fundamental thrift, recognizing value in what others considered garbage and refusing to spend money on items that could be made from waste. The next one is basically an old myth that's really a classic, but I'm not sure if it really works. It does definitely set you in a vibe, though. This time, the trick is to plant by the moon. And it was actually a really common idea for people to think that lunar phases had something to do with their crop health. I mean, today, people blame the activities of the moon for their doomed love life. So how much of a stretch is it to say your rice paddy didn't work out because of it? Lots of cultures had deities that worshipped the moon as a maternal, cultivating presence that was believed to help. In other places, the new moon to full moon waxing phase was believed to help above-the-ground crops like spinach and tomatoes, and it also was believed that plants retained water better during these times. While many gardeners swear by this, There hasn't been any real scientific research done into this subject to prove the effect of the moon on any kind of farming. Still, I'm not against anecdotal evidence. If your grandpa's grandpa did it, there's probably a reason. Plus, even if there isn't everything just a lot more scenic and climactic if you do it by the moon? I imagine a farming session at midnight probably feels therapeutic. Share in the comments which one of these tricks your grandmother still used the year you turned 10. The layered tin under the sink, the borax in the icebox, the saltpeter pinch she added to the Christmas ham without ever calling it by name. Because the truth was never that these hacks were dangerous. The truth was that they worked too well for too long, on too little money, against an industry that needed you to throw the old jar away and buy the new one. A kitchen used to be a place where memory did the chemistry. The label on the can did not. That is what a grandmother knew, and what a laboratory took 50 years to catch up to.